The story in today's episode is pretty bizarre. Why would a phenom fly tyer who Fly Fisherman magazine called one of the great fly tyers commits a felony robbery to steal almost 300 rare birds? And this gets even more bizarre as we find out how today's guest avoids jail time after committing a felony robbery. And today you're going to find out the why behind the feather thief and the crazy characters that make up this real-life thriller. This is the Wet Fly Swing podcast, where I show you the best places to travel to for fly fishing, how to find the best resources and tools to prepare for that big trip, and what you can do to get back to fish species we all love. How's it going? This is Dave. We've got Kirk Wallace Johnson on the podcast today, author of The Feather Thief and one of the greatest books that you likely will read this year if you're new to it. We find out about the Victorian salmon flies, this classic fly tying forum, and the members who purchased some of these stolen goods. We get into some of that background. We find out about Edwin's diagnosis with Asperger's and how that actually changes this whole dynamic in the book here today. We find out how Sacha Baron Cohen's cousin was actually the man behind this diagnosis. Another interesting spin. And it's just one bizarre turn after another. Definitely conservation. We talk about, pretty much everything around the salmon flies that we talk about here today. Plus, you're going to find out why this feather thief and the person behind the heist is now covering Metallica Master of Puppets albums on his flute, and why he's not tying flies in the public anymore. Respect. Here he is, Kirk Wallace Johnson. How you doing, Kirk?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I appreciate you put some time aside today to talk about this topic. I think this is really an interesting topic, The Feather Thief, the book that you wrote, which... in our world of fly fishing, I feel like, even though this is so extreme, I feel like it's not too far off because we're all so dedicated to fly fishing that you feel like you can almost put yourself in his place a little bit. These fly tyers, we get so addicted to it. But we're going to talk about this crazy story about a person who essentially commits a crime. And then we could talk about that a little bit around tying flies and stuff. But first off, take us back to fly fishing real quick. What's your experience in fly fishing? Do you have a kind of a first memory?
Oh, yeah. Well, so the truth is I grew up in the Midwest in Illinois, where my dad taught us that fly fishing was really just for like elitist snobs. And that's not what our family did. And so I grew up, we had literally a radioactive river running through our backyard, that I would just spin cast for carp and bullheads and things like that. And I just never once even considered fly fishing. And this will seem like a crazy detour, but I studied the Middle East and Arabic in college, and I ended up in the war in Iraq. I was working for the U.S. government. I was in charge of the reconstruction efforts in Fallujah, which was I don't expect people to even remember it at this point, but it was not a friendly place. And after a crazy year that was capped off with ironically, after surviving all kinds of stuff, I had a near-death experience while I was on vacation from the war. I sleepwalked out of my hotel window. It was some PTSD-triggered thing, but I was in what's called a dissociative fugue state. But I basically fell a couple stories to concrete.
Jeez.
Broke both my wrists, my jaw, my nose. I cracked my skull in a couple places. I had 150 stitches in my face, and I was like kind of circling the drain, but I survived and basically came back to the States for a year of surgeries and just general badness. I just was totally screwed up by the war and all of this. And at the time I was living in Boston, and a friend of mine said, "Hey, you should come out and do some fly fishing. Let's give it a shot." And I did I kind of hemmed and hawed and just had some mental block up about it that was really truly just like a hereditary, no, I don't fly fish. But I went up, we hired some guide, and it was on the Pemigewasset River in Maine. I think it must have been 2 hours north of Boston, and had my guard up, was being just generally closed-minded. And then it was about like 8 or 10 minutes into casting for the first time and realizing what was being activated in my mind, that it sounds so melodramatic, but like I knew I was going to be doing it for the rest of my life. I was, in a loving way, annoyed with my dad that I hadn't been exposed to this earlier. But I saw this whole world of knowledge and skills and things that had nothing to do with my normal life at that point. Because at the time I was in a very intense battle with the US government, which took up the better part of a decade, but to help my Iraqi colleagues who were being assassinated because they worked with us during the war. When I got back from that first day fishing, I slept better than I had slept in years. I remember closing my eyes and I could see trout kind of fanning on my eyelids, and I just fell into this deep sleep. And that really became something of an addiction, where any chance I could get, I would just throw my gear in the trunk of the car at 4 a.m. and just basically flee up into the mountains. I was trying to get away from the stresses of my job. My cell phones, I would excitedly wait until my cell phone signal dropped, and the world kind of just would be walled off, and it would just be the trout and me, and however much I had sort of absorbed or learned or improved from the last time that I went out fishing. And that really, I think I kind of unwittingly or luckily just stumbled into fly fishing as some form of, I don't know, therapy or mental health. It was just,
right.
Your listeners will all know this better than I ever did at that point, for sure. But it was demanding enough of my concentration that I would be relaxed at the same time, but I would be so focused on trying to balance all these different variables that 9 hours would truly feel like about 45 minutes to me. And now, I mean, my wife, like, I live in Los Angeles now, and it's not a mecca for anglers. But she knows that if we are in a spot in the country where I can go fly fishing, and she knows if I tell her that I'm just going to go out for the morning, I'll be back by noon. Like, she knows that I may not be back until after dinner. So that's really the origin. But I did not cast a fly for the first time in my life until I was probably 27.
That's amazing. I think that's the great thing about fly fishing or any of these hobbies or sports or whatever, right? It doesn't matter when you start. We've talked to people that have fished for, 80 years and people that just got started yesterday. And it's always, there's very similar, right? That passion seems to be the thing with fly fishing. And the Project Healing Waters, we're doing an event with them, the project in there. I mean, I think that's kind of what you're speaking to, right? This stuff, people that are in war and things like that, and what fly fishing can do, to help you, right? So part of that is what you've seen. So how did for you, you have that going on, and when did the whole feather thief, when did you first hear about that, this story about this kid essentially committing this crime?
So it was I believe the fall of 2011. There's a writer's residency down in Taos, New Mexico. So I was running my nonprofit, but I was also supposed to be working on a book about this whole sort of battle on behalf of my Iraqi colleagues. And I'm down in New Mexico. I was not really making any progress on the book. I didn't really know how to write a book at that point. I didn't even have an agent. I didn't have a book deal. And the war was still kind of raging. And so I just felt really trapped. I wanted to do something else with my life at some point. The nonprofit that I started had gotten thousands of people out, and so that it was rewarding. But I felt like if I didn't have some big change, that I was going to be doing this for the rest of my life. And I wanted to try other things. I didn't even support the war in the first place. And now I had spent almost like a decade of my life trying to kind of mitigate the consequences of it. So that was my mental state, was basically just feeling trapped. And I brought my fly fishing gear down with me to Taos, but I was still I still think of myself as pretty new to it all, even though I probably always will feel that way. But I was like, all right, I know there's waters all around here. I got to hire a guide, just because I'd done enough on my own to know that I needed to just fork over the money for a guide, at least the first time out on a new stream. So I go on Google. There's like a few results. I just honestly picked one at random, and I get this guide by the name of Spencer Syme. He takes me out. I think the first day we went out was on the Red River, and I just want to fish. I'm drilling him with questions about fly fishing, and he had like Googled me, so he's trying to talk to me about the war, but I didn't really want. I wanted to escape all that, right? but I mean, it was a good conversation. We were like quickly becoming friends, but he could tell like I just, what my priorities were. We're like hooking into some decent fish, and then at some point he opens up one of his fly boxes. We're like in the middle of this stream, and I catch this glimpse of like this just hulking huge fly in there that was unlike anything I had seen before. And I was like, what is that thing? Like it was just had a dozen different colors on it. It was, whatever, 15 times the size of a normal fly. I'd never seen a salmon fly, much less a sort of Victorian dress salmon fly. And so he starts sort of introducing me to that realm of fly tying and about the species and about the Victorian era that gave rise to it. And he starts talking to me about Kelson and Blacker and these other, the feather trade. And, we're fishing and working our way up this stream, but I'm just pumping them because I've just had never heard of this world, much less this subculture of guys that are tying it. And I swear I'm in the middle of a cast, and he's like, I mean, man, if you think all this is so interesting, you ought to hear about this kid that just broke into the British Museum of Natural History, and he stole like $1 million worth of these dead birds in order to sell to this cultish community of Victorian salmon fly tyers. And as he was saying it, I kind of just froze because it was such a bizarre idea that it didn't even seem like it could be true. But I felt like I could see like the whole book right there in front of my eyes. And for the rest of the day, I was peppering him because he knew the feather thief at that point. Spencer is one of the best salmon fly tyers there are. He's an incredible guide. And at first, when I got back to my place, I didn't even think, it's like all love to Spencer. I'm guilty of it too. But, the it rises the closer you get to a riverbed, right? And
Right.
So it's like,
right.
And so I was like, how much of this is really happening? Like, how much of this is true? And I just started this descent into this forums and then into these private Facebook groups. And I did not think of myself as even a journalist at that point or an investigative journalist. I had never written a book. I had this dream of writing this memoir about my Iraq stuff, but it became this truly like an obsession for me. So whenever I couldn't fish and whenever I was not working on my nonprofit work, I was basically just following this crime, figuring out how to get people to talk to me, doing screenshots and just amassing this, mountain of evidence and information and trying to basically figure out what happened. Because at that point, there were still tons of aspects of the crime that had not been solved.
That's right. So the crime when did it happen? Was it 2009 or 2010?
2009 was the crime. And then
they caught him a year later.
Caught him, yeah, I think around 15 months later. And then I think he had just received what they call a suspended sentence. But basically, they said, go on your way, no real punishment.
Let On DeMark Lodge give you the Montana fly fishing experience you deserve. The gin-clear waters of the Missouri River offer a world-class experience with one of the finest rainbow trout and brown trout fisheries in the world. Whether you're a seasoned angler or new to the sport, their family of guides will tailor a trip just for you. You can head over to ondemarklodge.com to fish one of the great trout streams in the country. One of the things about this story, I mean, the whole book, you're on your edge. It's one of those books where you can't put it down. You just got to keep going on it. But I think that's partly because you don't know what's going to happen. You're really good. It's amazing that was your first book at the time because the way you wrote it, you kept everybody on the seat of their pants. But I'm interested, you said, you could see the book at the start, like early on. Did the book that you saw early on, how did that compare to the book that actually came out later?
I would say that there's something about this story that every step of the way got way more absurd and crazy and bonkers than I expected back on the river that day. And so there are times where even now, like, I mean, sometimes I'll think about it. I'm like, I can't believe that happened. And we can get into this, but it's not an isolated incident anymore.
Now, what do you mean? What's not an isolated?
A month ago, I would have said that I'm at 5 separate museum heists that have been done in the name of stealing these exotic birds for fly tyers. Edwin's was the most egregious, but now we're at 6 because a museum in France, in a kind of smaller town museum in France, just got, there was a big heist of, I think, roughly 600 birds.
Wow.
And I'm figuring out where, like, I'm talking to all these ornithologists and curators because we're trying to get the list of species to see if they match those that are mostly targeted by this community. But the demand for these things is only increasing. And I think one of the consequences of the book is that, I mean, I've been told by several sources that after it came out, it basically pushed the trade deeper underground and made it harder to buy and sell these feathers. And the result of that is that the value now has roughly quintupled.
Oh, wow. So it's just getting crazier. That's the really interesting thing about this story. I think you hit on that, right? The fact that, you've got this kid, essentially, who was a kid who stole these things because of this addiction to fly tying, But it's really interesting because you have this whole other piece, and you talk about in the book about the Darwin and Wallace, about how there's this whole history of these biologists, ecologists. Darwin, right? Nobody's bigger than that. And there's that piece where they're doing it for research and to improve humanity, right, and everything in our knowledge. But then you have these fly tyers, essentially they're stealing it for fly tying, right? I mean, what's your take on all that? Like, because it seems so crazy, because at the same time, I also think of fly fishing and fly tying as very conservation minded. Like, I think that's a big thing people talk about. We're all interested in protecting these species, even as we see climate change and stuff going on. What is your take on the book? Did you think about that when you're writing it, that was going to be a theme, a big part of it?
No, it's a great question. I mean, when I started, I knew Darwin, but I didn't know anything about the historical stuff that's in the book. And it really is, just for people who haven't read it, it's kind of fascinating because some of the birds that were stolen by Edwin were central to us unlocking the theory of evolution. They have been used by scientists that have gone into the Natural History Museum for centuries. The same specimens have been interrogated by generation after generation of scientists, each of them bringing new technology and new questions. Alfred Russel Wallace, the naturalist that gathered a number of the birds that Edwin stole, he really incredibly described these specimens as the individual letters that make up the words of the deep history of the earth. And that if we allow these things to disappear or to be damaged or stolen, we're basically losing a glimpse into the past. And so a biologist now can pluck a single feather, and with the technology that exists with, isotopes and all that stuff, like, they can completely reconstruct what the food web was for that bird at that moment in time. Scientists have understood that these birds and all specimens in these natural history museums, they hold answers to questions that people haven't even thought of yet. And, I started this investigation with basically a grade schooler's understanding of natural history museums, that I thought you just go, there's 100 birds in glass cases, and then that's it. I had no clue about the vastness of the scientific collections. And so the Natural History Museum in Tring, which was the museum that Edwin targeted, second largest ornithological collection in the world behind New York. If my memory serves, it's something like 750,000 birds in there. And these are not, their wings aren't outstretched. They're not on display. Everything's drawn tight to the body, and they're in thousands of cabinets, in tens of thousands of drawers. And they are, it's a vault. You have to it's not easy to get in there. Well, it's not that easy to get into.
Right.
And literally, some of them have been there for 5 generations of curators. So I didn't know any of that. I had no clue about any of that. There's 2.5 miles of shelving just for birds that are preserved in spirits. There's 500,000 eggs there. Efforts to sort of ward off extinction, they're drawing on DNA from these old specimens. Anyways, it's endless what these things can be used for. The other touch point, since you talk about conservation, is that in the Victorian era, Victorian salmon fly tying didn't come out of a vacuum. It's the result of what has been described as the single largest direct extermination of wildlife in the history of the planet, was hunters killing all these exotic birds for women's hats. And anyone listening to this who's tied a classic or a salmon fly understands, they know all of this. They know that everyone's looking for their great grandma's hat in the attic because it might still have some of these birds in it. And so all of the stuff, Blacker, Kelson, all of that coincides with this sort of glut of literally hundreds of millions of birds being killed and showing up in the feather districts in London and in Paris and New York. And so all these guys started, inventing their own salmon flies. And it was also just as women were using these birds to sort of display status, these guys were sort of showing off and flaunting what exotic feathers they could tie into their patterns. So again, all of that I started out with zero knowledge of. Now, there's one point in your question that I always feel like I always want to jump at, which is there is a laser beam, bright red line in the fishing community between guys who actually know how to fish, who actually go out and fish, and then this tiny subset of Victorian salmon fly tyers, the overwhelming majority of whom have never even fished with any of them.
Oh, really? So most of these tyers are not fly anglers?
No.
That's amazing. I didn't know that.
To this day, I don't think the feather thief has ever fished.
Oh, wow. No kidding.
Yeah. And so there is I give talks all over everywhere about the feather thief. And if I meet an angler, I know this guy's a fan and he loved the book. If I meet a Victorian fly tyer, I've got I'm wondering.
You got your work cut out for you. Yeah. It's gonna be a battle.
Those guys hate me.
They hate you.
Oh yeah. And so, which is fine, no big deal. I've got a full life, but there is so you talk about the sort of conservation ethos in fly fishing. That's exactly what I've seen. But that's because these guys are out there, they're seeing the impacts of humanity on these streams that they love and on the fish and all of this. And so you'd have to be an idiot if you love fly fishing to not take up that call and to try to do something about it. These guys are completely divorced from reality. And as you know, there's no effing fly in the world that looks like a green Highlander. No real bug in the world. You don't have to be some PhD biologist to understand that there's no reason on earth that a salmon in Scotland is going to be naturally attracted to a bird of paradise feather from the highlands of New Guinea. Those two creatures are never going to meet each other. And so there's an artifice to all of this. Listen, I haven't done hardly any salmon fishing. I had tons of salmon anglers write to me and sent photos of flies that they've caught salmon on. I know they're not easy to catch, but I also know that I have seen flies where it's literally a candy bar wrapper tied to a hook in desperation, dog fur.
Everything.
Yeah. And so these guys have all bought into this religion that the only way you can tie these things is if you're using the exact species referenced in these 19th century books that they look to, like monks look to religious texts, when it was then and it's now.
Yeah.
None of this stuff matters. And the result of this kind of monastic adherence to recipes that should be updated, that should be for God's sakes, just dye some pheasant or chicken feathers or whatever. And it's incredible what people can do now with dyeing.
Oh yeah.
But they won't do it. And as a result, it is like a conveyor belt to breaking international laws. And I see these young kids that are getting hooked just like Edwin, and they're being told that only the real deal, only the true tyers are tying with CITES protected species. God. And lo and behold, I mean, some of the other crimes I can't get into now, but there's a lot of museums that have been broken into where these guys, this is the end point of this obsession, is basically just thievery and lying to others and lying to yourself. And I'm just, it's like, I sound like a moral scold, but if there's an edge to my voice, it's that one of the results of this book coming out is that Spencer, the fly fishing guide that first told me about this story, he has twice had to go to law enforcement for death threats that he has received from this community for the sin of telling me this story. So this is not I'm so tired of the kind of crocodile tears that these guys have about this book calling them out, because they have not reformed at all. And they cannot defend what they're doing. the only thing that we're seeing here is that they're not embracing sustainable tying. They're not embracing dyed feathers, because I get it. If you've spent stupidly 50 or 100 grand over your life on exotic feathers, you're going to view suddenly tying with some, whiting chicken hackle dyed or something, like that's a threat to you.
Yeah. Right.
And so there's a hostility that they have towards all this.
Yeah, it's a crazy story. So and I didn't even realize this. I mean, I've known about Atlantic salmon flies for a long time, always thought they were beautiful. Didn't know this. In fact, I know I've had a few guests on who have tied Atlantic salmon flies, and I have some videos and stuff too. And they are actually fishermen, right? Steelhead fishermen, stuff like that. So I think there are some people out there, but this extreme thing you're talking about is crazy. And I think Edwin is such a good example. That's why your book does such a good part of it, because it explains about this person. So maybe take it there, because you actually interviewed him, right? I mean, you sat down with this person, and then there was other people who thought you may have been accomplices who you talked to. What do you say, what do you talk, for somebody who hasn't read the book, about Edwin? What did you learn about that person?
Yeah. So one quick thing about your friends that are fishing for steelhead. My guess is that they're probably it's not like I have some beef against salmon fly tying in principle. Sometimes I always feel like I need to say, it's not like I got bullied when I was a kid by a fly tyer and this is my revenge. But my guess is that they're probably tying with subs, because some of these flies, to tie them right, require thousands of dollars of feathers. So I don't know. There's not that many anglers that have that kind of money to chuck a $2,000 fly into a river. So just so the audience understands, it's like these things are ultimately, the ones that are tied with exotics are meant to be put in a display case. They're pieces of art.
Okay. Yeah. So, and I am thinking about, now that I think about the flies, I've actually got two of them he tied me. They're more like spay flies and D flies. So they are a little bit different than the Atlantic salmon stuff.
Yeah. So on Edwin, I've often said this, that if we had met in a different context, I think we probably would have become good friends. He's a remarkable guy. He grew up in Hudson Valley area and was not an outdoorsy kid. He was homeschooled with his younger brother, pretty gifted. He was a virtuosic flautist. And so that was the kind of ordering influence in his life, was practicing the flute night and day. But when he was around 10, his dad, who was a journalist, was working on, I think it was for Popular Mechanics or something, but it was an article about the physics of casting a fly. And as part of his research, he was watching one of those Orvis 101 videos. It was a VHS back then. I don't know if it was Rosenbauer doing it or what.
Right.
And there was a brief section on just tying a rudimentary trout fly. And young Edwin is walking through the living room at that moment when the host was demonstrating how to palmer hackle around the hook. And Edwin saw this kind of ordinary chicken feather, and as it was coiling around the shank of the hook, it just transformed. And suddenly it was just splayed out in every direction. And how could something so ordinary just suddenly, with this little bit of thread, become something different? And for whatever reason, that just transfixed him, and he sprinted to his parents' room. He pulled some feathers out of his mom's pillow. He ran to the garage looking for hooks, and he just started trying to tie a fly. Very quickly, his parents doing what, I'm doing this now with my own kids. They just fed it. And so they set up trout fly tying classes at the local fly shop. And that led to, he was so good at it and so sort of devoted to it that they start bringing him to fly tying, shows and festivals throughout New England. And he starts competing as a 12-year-old, 13-year-old in fly tying competitions where, they're whoever ties the most perfect woolly buggers in an hour wins a trophy. And he's dominating.
Right.
Just mopping up these older dudes that have been doing this forever. And in one of these shows, he's wandering around. I think he's waiting for the judges to sort of tally up his flies. By the way, I think he was tying, in one of them, I think he tied over 60 perfect flies in 1 hour.
Oh, wow. 60.
Yeah.
Wow. That's amazing.
Yeah. my son is now getting into fly tying, and a friend of mine was like, just make sure you don't get him into the flute, like we're,
Ah, right.
but so anyways, Edwin's wandering around this show, and he stumbles across the booth of a kind of legendary classic fly tyer named Ed Muzzerall out of Maine. Everyone calls him Muzzy. And it's like this alien art form to Edwin. He's been tying all these, caddis flies and stuff, and they're not beautiful. And suddenly here's all these gorgeous, just otherworldly looking, colorful flies that have a completely different sort of heritage to them. And he's just gripped, and he starts talking to Muzzy, and he's, how do you do this? And his dad sets up a weekend that they're going to go get private lessons with Muzzy to basically start learning how to tie a classic salmon fly. Over the course of the weekend, they're doing 8 hours to tie a single fly, and Muzzy's kind of introducing him to this world that Spencer introduced me to when he was first telling me about fly tying. And sure enough, Edwin's gifted at this too. And it's different from, I can tie an elk hair caddis that'll catch me some trout, but this is a world apart. You've got to marry fibers together, and
It's the opposite of 5 dozen per hour. It's literally, these could take you hours to tie one fly, right?
Yes. I had Spencer, I wanted to tie one just to see what it was like. And I wanted to see if it activated anything in my brain. And after about 7 hours, I'm like, yeah, okay, this is not like
Too much.
Yeah, it's just not,
I know.
not really getting it. But at the end of that weekend, during which they had been tying with dyed feathers, Muzzy gives Edwin a little envelope, and he goes, you gotta earn the right to use these. You gotta work your way up here, but this is the real deal. Essentially, this is what separates the men from the boys. And
Man.
Edwin opens it up, and I think it was like around a few $100s worth of exotic feathers. They weren't illegal. They were just expensive. But that sort of set up the kind of stakes of this all. So, Edwin he starts just tying like a maniac, but he's just using, turkey and chicken and pheasant and stuff. And he is so good at what he does that he is hailed as the future of fly tying in Fly Tyer magazine. But as he told me, there was the way that he described it was, he knew he was tying fakes. They weren't the real thing because they weren't the real species. And he said that he could tie one that looked almost virtually identical to a lay person, but that the knowledge of the falsity of the feathers would eat away at him.
Wow.
But whenever he would find some bird that would pop up on eBay, he was always getting outbid by, grown-ups who had disposable income. And so as good as he was, it was a sort of, there was this longing for more and for being able to tie the real thing. And there are some, this is getting into it, but there are some like series of flies, like there's something called the Traherne series. I think it's maybe 20 or 25 flies, I can't remember, that literally only a few living people have tied the complete set. And so there's huge bragging rights to basically have acquired enough of the feathers in order to tie the whole series. And so he had kind of these dreams that could only be unlocked with real feathers. And so he's still doing the flute. He wins admission into one of the best schools in the world, the Royal Academy of Music in London. And right before he gets there, one of his mentors in the fly tying world tells him about this museum and says, you gotta get in and see these birds. You'll weaken the knees, like it'll change your life.
And who was that? Who was that person that told him about that?
That guy was a French Canadian by the name of Luc Couturier.
Yeah, Couturier, right?
Yeah, and so who Edwin referred to as the Michelangelo of fly tying. And so basically, that first visit, which he basically lied in order to get access to the museum, into that sort of research vault. From that point on, he started plotting the heist to go and ultimately steal these things.
So that's it. So that's where the whole plot, thickens, and and then he goes through the whole thing of doing the act and doing it, and then you're unsure if he did it alone and everything. But Yeah, there's just so much going on, and like we said, we got these different ends of it, all the people. But ultimately, you're wondering whether he did it alone. Are you pretty convinced now that it was just Edwin that was out there? It sounds like from the book that's what you kind of the conclusion you drew.
Yeah, I mean, it was one of the most sort of devilish parts of the whole investigation, which is there were moments in my interview with him, and it took me, by the way, I think almost 4 years to get him to agree to an interview.
Oh, no kidding. So it took 4 years to get him, and then you spent like 8 hours with him or something like that, right? Yeah.
Yeah. And so there were moments in that interview where there were some answers where I was like, well, that's a little odd. I don't know. I asked him like what kind of suitcase, how big was the suitcase? And then I asked him what color it was that he stole the birds in, and he didn't remember what color it was. And I was like, I might be weird, but I know what color my suitcases in my life have been,
Right.
But after a ton of back and forth and actual studying the specimens themselves, I do think that a single person could have gotten them all out themselves that night. But I can never be 100% sure that he didn't have some kind of help that night. And I certainly know that he did not act alone when it came to selling them.
No, and that's what you get into with the one of the people you interviewed as well, right? That's somebody who was helping to get it. And then it gets back to the whole fly tying, right? Where you get into that piece where, they sold them. So there was 299, right, that he stole. They recovered some, and then there's about, I think, what was it, 60 or something like that that were never recovered? Is that what's left?
The numbers were always so frustrating because I was also going up against the Natural History Museum, which has always been trying to kind of minimize the severity of this as a sort of face-saving exercise because they're just embarrassed. But he stole 299 birds. I think about 100 were recovered with their tags intact, meaning that they were still good for science. There was about a third that were recovered in fragments. And so to me, what that means is that they might have gotten like a breast patch from a red ruff fruit crow and then counted that as a red ruff fruit crow returned. But they
lost the best feathers.
Yeah. That's not the whole thing or whatever, right? And so it roughly broke down into, I would estimate 100, 100, 100. And the value, especially now since the book has come out, but I mean, there are still hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of materials stolen in this heist that are out there circulating.
Right. And they're circulating between, essentially, I mean, they're the fly tyers. That's who these people they're tying have these stolen necks or whatever.
Yeah. And some of them, like I have tons of sources in this community that their heads are screwed on straight, but they still love tying classics. And, there were people calling me from fly tying shows. I just got a call recently. The earlier ones were right before the book came out. Multiple sources called me to say they had overheard conversations from the fly tying show saying, we've got to sell this before Kirk's book comes out and the feds come down on us. Another source just called me 2 weeks ago to say that I went to one of these fly tying shows early on in my investigation, and apparently there were a ton of the trained birds, a ton of Edwin's birds being sold in the hotel room while I was there.
Mm.
And so I was right there when it happened. It's just this one guy finally revealed this knowledge that he was in the room when they were discussing where they came from. And so again, it's like there are Victorian salmon fly tyers that have their heads screwed on straight that have not become sort of compromised by this, and they're totally happy to tie with dyed feathers, or they do the due diligence to make sure that they've got lawfully acquired feathers. There are also a ton who don't ask questions because they don't want to know the answer. And there's also a kind of silliness that I have witnessed in parts of the subculture where they think that if they just say this magic phrase, that this is a pre-CITES bird, CITES being the convention that will outlaw the trade of endangered species. They think that if they just say this phrase, oh, it's a pre-CITES bird, that it gives them license to buy or sell it. It doesn't.
Do you think you need a bush plane to fish Alaska's legendary waters? Think again. FishHound Expeditions specializes in road-accessible adventures that don't skip on excitement. Picture yourself fishing for massive rainbow trout, Arctic grayling, and plenty of salmon species all within Alaska's epic road system. It's doable. I fished the road system on our first day with Adam and the crew, and it did not disappoint. The largest leopard rainbow I caught and landed was right off the road system. And we'll be driving up again this year, heading up from the lower 48 all the way up to Alaska to hit those streams again. You'll experience the breathtaking beauty of Alaska's wilderness, from mountain streams to hidden rivers, perfect for anglers of all levels. FishHound Expeditions makes it easy to explore Alaska. Why wait? Your Alaska adventure is just a drive away. Book your spot now before spaces fill up. That's FishHoundExpeditions.com. FishHound Expeditions.com. Don't miss out. When it comes to premium flies that deliver results, Drifthook.com is the name to trust this season. Whether you're chasing trout with dry flies, swinging streamers, or dialing in those Euro nymphs, they've got everything you need. Here's a quick story. I was fishing a tricky spring creek earlier this year and nothing was working. Then I pulled out a royal wolf from the Drifthook box. I cast upstream, letting it drift effortlessly toward a holding fish. It was textbook. One of the biggest fish in the run rose, sipped the fly, and the fight was on. That's definitely a moment I'll never forget. Their fly kits ship free straight to your door, fully stocked and ready for action. You can support a great small business right now in this podcast by heading over to drifthook.com today. That's Drifthook, Drifthook. Use the code SWING at checkout to get 15% off your first order. Pre-CITES birds, so they're saying it's like grandfathered in that they can sell them because they're old. Okay.
Right. And so what they don't understand, and this is just the most basic like legal framework, if you find a Victorian hat in your grandma's attic and you've got these birds, and obviously like CITES was 71, I think.
Okay.
Then yes, you can tie with those feathers. But just because you found it in grandma's attic, even if it's pre-71, you can't then sell them. You're not grandfathered in to sell. It bans the trade of these things. And so you can go on eBay right now, and there are people selling illegal species of feathers for fly tying. And they do this little tap dance like, oh, it's pre-CITES. It's nonsense.
Oh, wow. So everybody... And eBay's not, I mean, it must be a big, so they're not doing, and how do they get around that? Because there's a law there. How do they not get cracked down on?
What they do is they'll take a listing down if someone flags it. And so eBay, when I started sending questions, when I was writing the book saying, like, how can you explain, like, you guys are making money off of these sales, I would send them numerous listings of, in some cases, critically endangered species that were being sold. And then the listings would just disappear. eBay would just swat them down, but it was just damage control. And so the fly tyers are using, slang words and things like that to try to, they're not putting the Latin binomial name of the species on there.
I gotcha.
So at any rate, there are ways for them to get around it. But honestly, a lot of this now happens in private Facebook groups where they're quite clear. It's a trusted community. They explicitly say, don't publicly talk about deals. If you do, delete it right away. So they know what they're doing.
Yeah. And it's a private group, right? So, and Facebook, again, it gets into that whole thing of I mean, you've got all these social media groups and ways to get around it. But, getting back to Edwin, which, I mean, there are some amazingly crazy characters in this story, but one of them was, I think this is kind of bizarre too, Dr. Baron Cohen, right? Like Sacha Baron Cohen, the Ali G, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, it's his cousin or brother, or which one was it?
It's a cousin.
The cousin. So literally, Ali G's cousin is this. Well, talk about him a little bit and how Asperger's comes into this, because did Edwin know he had Asperger's at any point before this came up?
He told me that he had never even heard of it, if I recall. He certainly didn't have a diagnosis or anything before all of this. But basically, right around the time that Edwin was arrested, there was this huge case playing out in the UK of an autistic kid that had hacked into the Pentagon, I think, and had disabled something. And the US was trying to extradite this kid to here. I mean, it was there were members of parliament. Pink Floyd recorded a song like in support of, like, to defend this kid against being sent to. And ultimately, it was Baron Cohen's diagnosis and recommendation against incarceration that was the decisive thing that allowed the Brits to basically reject the extradition request.
Oh, wow.
So, right, that's the kind of context of what's happening. And so, I can't say exactly what discussions happened or what was going on in the mind of Edwin's attorneys, but here you have a gifted kid who had a obviously obsessive love of these feathers and of fly tying. The case, or the theory of the case that they put forward, was that it was a mental disorder, that it was an obsession, it was a compulsion driven by an Asperger's diagnosis that he ended up getting from Baron Cohen, that basically he wasn't even really in control of his own. He was almost like autopiloted into committing this thing, and it was impulsive
Right.
and
Like Pulsive, and for this crazy, he's a fly tyer. Who would go for just fly tyer, right? He's doing it
yeah,
because he's this passionate, impulsive thing.
right. And that resulted from, I mean, and I had some exchanges with Baron Cohen about this. The diagnostic that Baron Cohen invented to do this assessment, you could download it, and you could also download basically like the grid for scoring it. And so I asked him, I was like, well, is it possible that it could be gamed? Could someone fake it? And Baron Cohen did tell me, paraphrasing, but essentially, yes. He said, yes, it could be faked, but this is where expertise comes into it. But Baron Cohen, I don't think, spent more than a couple hours with him, and was kind of charmed by him and really marveled at the beauty of these flies. So he wrote a letter to the court basically saying, you can't put this kid in prison, like it's going to be bad for him. The lawyers were able to cite another case of a kid with Asperger's whose sentence was tossed out on appeal because of that diagnosis. And so basically the judge's hands were tied. And so Edwin was essentially given a slap on the wrist. He was given a suspended sentence, so a year or so for just don't commit any other crimes and you'll be good. He had to cough up what money he had in his bank account, maybe like, I think it was maybe 15 grand or something. And then there was some kind of restitution that he was supposed to pay back, but that rarely happens. Astonishingly, he was still awarded a degree by the Royal Academy of Music.
Wow.
After all of this, I've known people that have, stolen $100 or something, and they get expelled from their university, So one of the hardest parts of the book to write was that one, because I wanted to make sure that, I'm not a clinician. I'm not some expert on this. So I wanted to treat it with the sensitivity it deserved, but I think the reader can make their own conclusions about where I fall on the validity of that.
That's right. Did justice prevail, right? And you have this thing here, and that's the interesting thing about being an author, and you probably know this now, obviously, is that you get in the characters of the people, even when they're potentially criminals or have done some violent, even violent crimes, right? You have these stories you get, and you're like, oh, I could see how Edwin could do that. Oh, maybe it's not that big of a deal. I like the birds. Do we really need 300 of those birds, or whatever it is, hundreds of thousands of those birds, right? And you start to convince yourself. I think that's what Edwin probably did. And I think a lot of people, you can do that. You can justify it, right? Do you find that that's a common theme out there with a lot of your experience in talking to people with the story?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, it's a great point. It's that, as outlandish as this crime was, I think all of humanity is on the same spectrum with Edwin. And I think all of us have something that we love so much that it might cloud our judgment a little bit. There aren't so many hobbies that so quickly push you to the other side of the law as classic salmon fly tying.
Right.
But to me, there's a simple, clear moral line of like, hey, I know you like this stuff, but sorry, it's illegal. You may not agree with the law, but you certainly can't go break into museums and steal this stuff. It's not yours.
Right.
So however much sort of moral justification you can sort of dupe yourself into buying like that, that's on you. But this is still like a theft from humanity, because we don't have those birds, and we don't know what kind of breakthroughs they might have afforded, because you can't go back and get a bird from 1840 anymore. And the world has changed since 1840. And so there might be something in that specimen that is crucial.
Yep. That's why this is such a huge I think, story is that, we're talking about Darwin and the evolution and like what is lost, in those 100 or 200 skins.
But you and I are like, I mean, I'm talking to you on an iPhone.
Right.
It's chock full of rare metals that are rare earth metals that are being, in some cases, there are armed conflicts where there are militias that are destroying countries and devastating communities in order to get access. The Democratic Republic of Congo has basically reinstated slavery in its cobalt mines.
Jeez.
There have been, allegations of like child labor to assemble these things. But I'm using it, right? And we're benefiting from it. Like there's one of the bigger themes of this book is like, it's about our relationship to a natural world that is kind of disappearing before our eyes and whether or not we can pull back from the brink. The Victorian feather trade is the reason why we have wildlife areas in the United States. The very first conservation laws were passed to stop feather poachers from basically pushing the egret into extinction. The very first game wardens ever appointed to protect wildlife in 1901 to 2 or whatever, the first game wardens ever sent to protect birds were murdered by feather poachers. And they were basically exonerated because people couldn't imagine why there would be a law to protect wildlife or to set aside natural areas. And so in some ways, the modern conservation movement emanates from the excesses of the feather trade. And it has been an incredible result, at least as far as the recovery of a lot of these bird populations that were pushed to extinction, near extinction. So this is a very niche crime, but what it is touching are these central sort of veins of modern existence. We're all complicit to some extent, and it's impossible to live a kind of totally pure, but you have to try, right?
Yeah, you got to do your best. I think that's where it comes back to the recycling, all this stuff. It's like, hey, what am I going to do by recycling one plastic bottle? But, that's the wrong mentality, right? It should be like, I'm going to do every bit, even if it's small. And then that's going to add up. The small, these little small things will add up over time.
Yeah. And so I think that's the kind of central devil and angel on either shoulder. It's like, there's whatever, I could do this and this will be mine. Or no, what are my values here? And like your values or your ethics are meaningless until they've been tested, until you're alone in a situation and it's up to you to decide how you're going to act. And I think a lot of people are surprised by how they act in that moment. But I can at least, for all of the kind of rationalizations, and I have critiques of the museums as well, but like I at least can say very black and white, like, sorry, this was wrong. Even people that bought this stuff that know it's from Edwin, to this day, years after the book came out, they should send it back to the museum. Even though it will do nothing for scientific research, it's wrong to have it.
Yeah, it's wrong. Yeah. I feel like when I look at this, again, I'm trying to make comparisons, and I go back to the kid thing in it. I mean, Edwin wasn't a kid, he was an adult, but I think of myself, and you probably shouldn't say this, but when I was a kid, I was probably 12, I don't know what I was, 11, 10. I got around this one older kid who was stealing stuff from the local store. And I found myself eventually doing that, and I got caught. And I remember sitting down with my dad that night. It was like the scariest thing ever. And it was like I had to wait for him to get home. I'm acting like I'm sleeping in my room, and he comes in and says, "Get up." He has that conversation, and it was actually a really good one. And to this day, I haven't stolen anything, right?
Yeah.
And I feel like that's a kid, right? But do you think, like, looking at Edwin, yeah, I don't know. You know what I mean? I'm not trying to make a comparison, but does that mean anything? Like, does Edwin have some, maybe that's the Asperger's thing, that you're kind of more like on that mentality. If that was true.
Yeah. Well, so anyone who, and by the way, Asperger's doesn't even exist as a standalone diagnosis anymore.
Oh, it doesn't.
It's just been folded into autism spectrum disorder. My son is on the spectrum, and anyone who has met anyone who is on the spectrum can tell you in a heartbeat, they have a heightened sense of right and wrong. They are deeply wounded if there's something unfair or there's something wrong. And so from a young age, I mean, when my son was 4, we weren't paying attention. He watched it was a documentary it was for grownups, but it was on the destruction of the oceans and all the trash and stuff. And the next vacation, he spent the entire time not swimming, just combing the beach looking for trash to pick up.
Oh, wow.
To your point, I was 5 when I stole a pack of gum that my mom wouldn't buy me. And I was a 5-year-old. I had a 5-year-old brain. And so my genius self, I started, and I couldn't wait to get home. And I started chewing the pack of gum in the car so she could smell it. And she like whipped the car around and dragged me into that shop. And I was bawling, and the shop owner was upset. And I had to basically do all of these chores to earn the money back. And that was a cauterizing moment.
Yeah.
In my mind of like, oh God, no, you can't. Just because you can get away with something doesn't mean you can do it. There's such a thing as a value and so Edwin did tell me, he's like, well, I was homeschooled, so I never really got in trouble. I had to call up like some national homeschoolers organization, some advocacy group, and ask them like, hey, do homeschooled kids have like an increased
Oh, yeah, right.
like amount of crime that they commit later? And they were like, who told you that? No,
Oh,
of course
wow.
not. And so I don't think, and also just to close one point, like his lawyers argued to the court that this was impulsive. I don't know how to just say it other than that they gave wrong information to the court in suggesting that it was only a couple weeks of planning. He planned this thing for something like 7 months. There was nothing impulsive about it. It was so deliberate, and he got away with it.
He got away with it, although he's not really tying flies anymore, I'm guessing, or at least in the public.
Yeah, not in public. If he is, he's not posting them anywhere that I've seen. Part of the reason why that diagnosis bothered me so much was there's a sense that like people who are on the spectrum should be given a pass because they don't know the difference between right and wrong, and I just fundamentally reject that. And so does the sort of just evidentiary record. So no, I don't. If I were to guess, this is just armchair analyst.
Yeah.
But I think as a general rule, I think Edwin usually is the smartest guy in the room. And I think, when that's the case, that can get you into trouble. That can lead to a sense of, I don't want to say immunity, but just sort of like, they're never going to figure this out.
Yeah, I mean, that's on Edwin. I think that's one of the interesting things. He's obviously the kind of the main character in this story, but in that interview, like, how did you, and I'm interested on this because I obviously do these interviews too. How did you prepare for that interview with Edwin? What was that like? Were you nervous at all? Talk about there. Take us there a little bit.
I don't think I've ever prepared more intensely for an interview than the one with Edwin. I was very anxious because I was flying halfway across the globe to meet him in Germany, and I didn't even have any assurance that he was going to show up. I didn't understand ultimately why he even agreed to the interview because there was not much upside. He didn't need to talk, and a huge part of my mind leading up to it was just whether or not I had just been played, and I just shelled out several grand to fly to Germany at the drop of a dime or whatever. But then I spent 100+ hours preparing the sequence of questions so that if I got him to tell me this in the first hour, this point, if I got him to acknowledge that, then he couldn't then deny it in the 4th hour when I got to this question, because we've already established that he knew this person, or he met, or he was there. And even with all of that planning, he was a formidable, if we're viewing it like a chess match, he was a formidable opponent.
He was good. He was good at it.
He could see my lines of attack coming way in advance. And if I didn't have a perfect poker face, if my brow furrowed just a little bit, he would read it and then adjust on the fly. And so, he's an incredibly savvy, smart guy. But I also didn't know if he was going to leave after 10 minutes. So I had to really kind of balance, like, let's just talk about happy stuff and childhood and all that before we get into it.
Right. Well, and that, I want to break there just for a sec. This is the thing that gets back to me, and maybe we could follow up after you wrap this question up. But a savvy and smart guy, but he did this heist, which when you look back on it, seems like he was bound to get caught, right? It seems like kind of like he wasn't that savvy and smart, actually, when you look at it. But keep going, and we'll follow up on that one.
Yeah, in my mind, he had done things that were pretty brazen and, in hindsight, not very bright. He had a personal website where he was listing photos of what are obviously museum specimens with their Latin names. And so that's pretty obvious, like how you could track that down. But he had this great advantage, which was that the victim of the heist, the museum, was not very aggressively trying to find out where it went, where all of its stuff went, because they were just so embarrassed by this. And so the only reason this all came crashing down was that there's a classic salmon tyer who happens to be in the police service of Northern Ireland,
Hmm.
whose identity I can't reveal, but he's the one that he was at a fly tying show somewhere in Holland, and he saw a suspicious specimen that one of Edwin's customers was showing off. That customer was basically bragging and just happened to be bragging to like one guy in law enforcement that, you know, his moral compass was functioning. And that quickly led to the tip that then once you had that data point, then everything snaps into focus and you can see Edwin's everywhere and you can see his website and all of that. So then it was
The Wayback Machine and all that.
yeah. But in my mind, I'm like, he didn't get caught that night. He didn't get caught immediately thereafter. He was very diligent in terms of who he sold to at first. He was able to buy what he wanted to buy with it. And so it's, you know, and ultimately he never spent a night behind bars.
Right. That's true. That's true. So I guess that is, yeah, he did achieve that.
Yeah.
Well, I wanted to touch base before we get out of here on the Classic Flight. Is it Classic Flight Tying Forum, or describe that again? What was the name of the forum that was the website that kind of where everybody was, you talked about it quite a bit?
Yeah, well, it's now defunct, but I think it was classicflytying.com, I think. So I mean, I'm staring at a filing cabinet that's just I've been meaning to put it into storage, but it's literally like thousands of pages of printouts from that forum that is completely kaput now.
So did that just go kaput because of all this, or just because of it just?
I don't know. I mean, I don't think forums are, but I don't think they're very costly to keep up. But I think a lot of stuff has now just moved on to Facebook and elsewhere.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, anything else about, I mean, I guess, you know, I think I've answered a few questions. This has been good for me. Anything else you want to highlight about the book or just the story, or anything that, you know, we could do to maybe help find those missing skins?
I guess what I would say is it's like, you know, because I'm sure you're going to hear from people in your audience that are like, Kirk's painting us with too broad a brush. And they're going to frankly whine about that.
Yep.
I just want to be really clear. I have no beef at all with people who are tying with legally obtained feathers. I think there's a lot of self-deception and kind of living in a fairy tale land where at this point, sorry, I can walk you through like offline, but there are so many crimes that have been committed now to feed this market. There's a university in America where their ornithological collection has basically, it has gone into kind of, there's a lack of oversight on it. And there was a corrupt grad student stealing birds from there and selling it to these guys.
Oh, wow.
So there's a point where I'm sort of like, who are you going to believe, me or your lying eyes? So that's one, and that sounds combative. I guess it is. But there are also, you know, I've gotten tips from guys who have read this book. You know, there was a guy, I won't go into details, but who was working in a fly shop, and some estate agent came in and said, hey, I'm handling an estate of a guy that passed away and he was an obsessive fly tyer. Can you come help me, you know, put a value on these bird skins? And that guy was like, these are probably, and that guy had been told that the deceased guy was bragging that these were from the Tring heist. And so if you're in this world, like you're probably getting hints of this. And I guess it's just the challenge of like what you do when that radar comes up, that this is all stuff that is part of a felony heist, that where the stuff is still circulating out there. I don't care about birds that have been legally purchased. Fine, go with God. Show your license for it, great. But don't attack the messenger here. I mean, you can. I don't care. My last book was about the Klan. My wife was worried about, like, am I going to get taken out by a fly tyer? I don't think so. But like, so I'm just, if people are mad with me, that's fine. But like, none of the reporting of the book has changed because none of it has been factually, everything in there. The last 100 pages of that book are the end notes that show you exactly the date and time and the location of who told me what, where on the record. And my guess is the people that listen to this podcast actually know how to, you know, chuck a fly out. And so that I like they're not gonna they're gonna understand.
Yeah, but they probably know some. I'll bet you some of those people know somebody who knows somebody who has a. I mean, it's Flight Time. I mean, the classic Flight Time forum, the Flight Time show, Furimsky's show back there, right? That's a major. I mean, that's connected. He owns the whole flight fishing shows.
Yep.
Right. I mean, that whole Flight Time. I mean, that's all connected. And are those flight tires still there? Are they these classic flight tires at that show? That's an annual show, right?
Yes. Although Spencer told me that he was disinvited from that show. I don't know.
Oh, no kidding.
That he was told that there's no room for sustainable salmon fly tires. So I don't know if that's still the case or if that was a formal policy. Maybe it was just a beef between Spencer and them. I don't know.
Wow. Yeah, I think it's such a again, like we talked, the conservation thing. I mean, there's nothing more important than that, I think, right? I mean, the challenge is, like you said, if you're a person, for example, I always go back to the person who is struggling to feed his family, like you start there before you're recycling, so there's certain things that happen in your life. But for most people, if you're kind of just an average person, I think that especially a fly angler, conservation is big. You want to do everything you can. We know what's going on with climate change. I've done stories all over the country with conservation groups, and we know water temperatures are warming, and we know we've got to do some stuff. So I think it's interesting to hear this connection now, because exotic birds is not that much different, right? If you kill off all these birds and the history of them, we're losing out on this. Is that kind of, do you feel like now when you look at the book, that is kind of your message, or maybe one message?
Yeah, no, it's certainly one of them. I don't think I do know fly tyers that have poachers that they're hiring to go and kill these from the wild, but for the most part, their supply is stealing from museums. But no, this is like an ultimate question of like, how do you want to exist in the planet that's changing? What kind of person and that is ultimately like you are constantly going to be confronted with decisions, and I'm no saint.
Yep. You're still flying, right? You still fly around the world.
Of course. Yeah, I still chuck stuff that I probably could recycle, and I convince myself like, oh, well, LA doesn't sort it well enough or whatever. But so I have no holier than thou position in all of this. It's just like there is a virtue in the struggle of just wrestling with what it means to be a human in the 21st century and what our relationship is to the natural world. If you decide that you don't give a shit about it, okay, fine. But if you do, then that creates certain obligations, and it's something that you got to teach your kids and instill those values in them and hope that they stick and all of that. But I don't really have any, I try to live in a reality-based world and in a truth-based world. And so the truth is there's no number of rationalizations that could ever convince me that tying 19th century recipes with critically endangered species or stolen specimens is somehow justifiable or defensible. When the salmon that you might conceivably hook with it you're not even aping an insect. They're just literally striking out of aggression. And so there's all of it is just this river of fancy that they've all convinced themselves means something when it doesn't mean anything. And so if it doesn't mean anything, then you can change it. And you can change it to use totally ethically harvested feathers. And I've been to Tom Whiting's operation.
Oh, yeah, it's amazing.
Whiting's a pal of mine. Like I've seen him, I've walked through these huge hangars where he's literally killing hundreds of chickens and baby chicks in front of me because he's culling the ones that aren't up to genetic match. And I got to tell you, like, a little discomforting, but I'm like, yeah, it's fine. I'm okay with it. Like that's he's not taking them from the wild. It's like, I eat meat. I'm a grown up with this stuff, but anyway, so I don't know if I'm making any sense.
Yeah, no, you are. Well, and I was going to say, I think, yeah, that makes total sense. I think it's kind of, the whole thing's a little bizarre, but and I think for me, the biggest thing that I didn't really know about was that these tyers are not even fly anglers for the most part.
No.
That's the other, I think, very bizarre part of this, is that somebody that's tying these salmon flies does not even fish. And that would change the whole thing, because if they did, it'd be a different thing. But one quick one before we get out of here, Edwin, I'm just curious, I'm not even sure if you know anything, but last time you heard of him, any idea what he's doing? Because I remember I think I saw a video of him playing the flute, like a Metallica song or something.
Oh, yeah.
Any idea what he's up to these days?
Not really. No, I mean, I think he's living in Europe, and I think he's like a professional musician. But yeah, I'm not in touch.
Yeah, you're not in touch. Yeah. Okay, Kirk. Well, I think we can leave this one here today. We'll send everybody out to kirkwjohnson.com if they want to connect. And your book's obviously out there everywhere. The Feather Thief, like we said today, amazing book. I think if anybody who hasn't read it yet, we've kind of given away some of the, the take-home message on it, but it's really awesome. And I appreciate all your time today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
All right, here it is. Please check in with Kirk if you get a chance. Get his book, Kirk W. Johnson. If you go to kirkwjohnson.com right now, check in there, go to Amazon, search for Feather Thief. Any place you get your books, you'll find this book. If you haven't read this thing yet, you definitely are going to want to check this out to hear a lot of the stories we didn't talk about today and hear how all the twists and turns. And if you get a chance, say hi to Kirk while you're out there. Please subscribe to this podcast if you want to get the next episode delivered to your inbox. And the next one's a good one. We're back with the Great Lakes Dude podcast. Jeff Liskay is back to bring his A game. Stay tuned on that. And also want to give one shout out to our Missouri River trip. Go to wetflyswing.com/Missouri. And we're heading out there this fall. If you want to get involved with this, enter your name, your email, and I'll follow up with you on details, let you know on availability. The Big Mo this year, if you're in the Missouri River area, anywhere out there, Montana, around the country, you want to check it out, we've got a spot and a trip for you right now. All right. Hope you have a great afternoon. Hope you're having a great evening. If it's morning, maybe it's early in the morning, you're getting up for fishing, getting ready to get going, and you're just listening to this. First off, I just want to say thanks for listening to the very end, and also appreciate you for supporting the podcast. We'll see you on that next one.
Thanks for listening to the Wet Fly Swing Fly Fishing Show. For notes and links from this episode, visit wetflyswing.com.